iniziare le presentazioni. Sono molto contenta di poter ospitare qui come Ciampi Visiting Professor, anche se con un invito breve, il professore James Dodd, un invito pensato da me e dal professor Ferrarin. James Dodd insegna filosofia alla New School for Social Research di New York, è uno studioso di fenomenologia, in particolare di Husserl, Jan Patočka. Tra le sue opere l'ultima, uscita per Northwestern University Press nel marzo 2023, The Heresies of Jan Patočka, Phenomenology, History and Politics. Nel 2017 Phenomenological Reflections on Violence, A Skeptical Approach, un libro interessante anche per gli studenti che seguiranno il seminario PhD sulla violenza, lo prenderemo in considerazione. Poi Phenomenology, Architecture and the Built World, uscito per Brill nel 2017, e Violence and Phenomenology, Routledge 2009, uscito poi in paperback 2014. Oggi il professor Dodd ci parlerà sempre attraverso Husserl e attraverso Patočka, sicuramente uscendo dai confini dei due autori, dell'idea di Europa e di post-Europa. Unitevi a me nel dare il benvenuto al professor James Dodd. Thank you. E venerdì mattina terrà una lezione nell'ambito del corso alle 10, sempre qui.
Good. So thank you, Professor Forti, and thank you to the Ciampi Institute for this opportunity to be part of your program. I'm very much honored to be here, and thank you all for coming out. So I should begin with an explanation of my title, my somewhat dramatic title. What I mean by the death of Europe is nothing quite so final as it sounds. There have been, and will hopefully continue to be, many historical Europes, each understood in its own way, and each in some fashion coming to an end. The twists and turns of this history are worth bearing in mind in what follows in my remarks. In the earliest non-mythical use of the name, Europe designates an indefinite landmass, a vague continental horizon for the ancient world that had been principally oriented around the Mediterranean basin. The outlines of Europe in a more definite sense begin to take shape with the establishment of Western Christendom as a religious political space, the result of a long process following the extended collapse of the Roman Empire. In the wake of centuries of devastating religious conflict, culminating in the 30 Years' War, this formation in turn gives way to a system of absolutist states coordinated according to principles codified in the Treaty of Westphalia. After another bout of revolution and war in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, this Westphalian order is succeeded by the Council of Europe, another unsteady system of international peace. This unity is again weakened in the wake of the revolutions of 1848, setting the stage for the cataclysm of the total wars of the 20th century, which in turn leads to the division of Europe into Western and Eastern blocs, dominated by powers that lie mostly outside of Europe. The revolutions beginning in 1989 then see the end of this divided Europe and the unfolding of the complicated history of European integration that continues to this day. Philosophers have often played a role in the articulation of a given idea of Europe. Sometimes this takes the form of a reflection on what it means to be a political community at all. Such reflections are often an expression of the politics of the moment. One thinks of the ideas of Plato and Aristotle formulated in the context of the tensions and challenges faced by the Greek polis. One also thinks of Augustine's idea of a spiritual community as a response to the sack of Rome by the Visigoths in 410. Then there is the Leviathan of Hobbes, written in the wake of the English Civil War, or Hegel's idea of the state, inspired by the enlightened despotism of Prussia under Frederick the Great and his successors. Sometimes the influence of philosophy is not only indirect, but involves an explicit formulation of an idea of Europe. Here one can cite Montesquieu's idea of Europe as the expression of a scientific culture, or even Burke's description of the French Revolution as deciding the fate of modern Europe. More rarely, Europe itself emerges as a specifically philosophical problem, as if the possibility of Europe were tied to the possibility of philosophy, and vice versa. An illustration of this way of thinking can be found in the writings of the Czech philosopher Jan Patočka, and this brings me to my topic. In what follows, I will present Patočka's understanding of Europe as an appropriation of the ideas of another philosopher for whom Europe was also a central philosophical problem, Edmund Husserl. My remarks will be organized in roughly 4 steps. First, I will situate Patočka's reflections on Europe in the historical context in which they are embedded. Here, I will be drawing from several texts written in the period between the collapse of the Prague Spring in 1968 and Patočka's death in 1977. One text is called Plato in Europe, a series of lectures from the early 1970s. Another is the Heretical Essays, which is Patočka's most famous work. And finally, Europe and Post-Europe, a lesser-known text that Patočka was working on at the time of his death. Second, I will explore some of the salient features of Husserl's concept of Europe, following his 1935 Vienna lecture, which is one of the sources of his last great work, The Crisis of the European Sciences. Third, I will sketch an account of Patočka's transformation of Husserl's approach, and then finally, fourth, I will close my remarks with some more critical considerations. So let us begin with the historical context in which Patočka is writing. This is not a mere footnote, but in fact gets to the heart of the matter. For what is striking about Patočka's discourse on Europe is his repeated emphasis on the historical situatedness of his own thinking. Patočka aims to actively respond to the moral demands of the situation in which he finds himself, and above all, to question the potential role of the philosopher in the contemporary world. It is also important to emphasize that Patočka works with the nuanced, if not always explicit, concept of situation. On the one hand, a situation is something eminently concrete. One is defined by a situation. It designates the specific set of conditions that provide the ground for understanding and confirming what, where, and who one in fact is. On the other hand, there is always something open in a situation, something undecided that forms an essential thread that runs through any context of life. A situation is thus more than a state of affairs. It is a moment that is bent towards its future. This encompasses what, if anything, remains to be decided, what action to take, what response to make, what meaning to affirm, what to deny or defend oneself against. To grasp a situation, this requires a sensitivity to the contingency of things, an awareness that it is not unproblematic and settled, that life has taken precisely the shape that it has. The specific situation Patočka has in mind is manifold, and its horizon is not limited to Europe. Locally, it is the situation of a Czechoslovakia locked in the stranglehold of normalization that unfolded in the wake of the Soviet invasion of 1968, driving out the hopes of reform communism and ushering in an era of enforced conformity that would last, with some variations, until 1989. In Central Europe more broadly, it was the situation of what Václav Havel described as the post-totalitarian society. The horrors of Stalinism were in the past, and the system was no longer terrorizing its citizens outright, as trapping them in an amber of lies, empty ideology, fear, and repression. Broadening the scope even more, it was the situation of a Europe divided between the rapidly expanding consumer society of the Western Bloc and an Eastern counterpart that had seemed to have been put, to again quote Havel, on ice, as if the very movement of history were taking place elsewhere. In Plato in Europe, Patočka evokes that feeling, so characteristic of his generation, that there is a fundamental unease that has come to mark the collective life of humanity. This sentiment transcends the specifically European situation, finding echoes well beyond its borders. One such echo is awareness of the looming ecological crisis that had been described in the 1972 report released by the Club of Rome, with its warning of an imminent ecological catastrophe as the result of the overconsumption of natural resources. Another echo is the opening address given by Eugene Ionesco at the Salzburg Festival in the same year, which gave powerful expression to a general feeling of powerlessness and alienation. As varied as these echoes may be, some being quite specific to recent history and the current local context, some shared by all human beings on the planet, some responding to a very real and defined threat, some to a more general sense of unease and instability, they all belong, Patočka suggests, to the unitary phenomenon of a common global situation. Patočka invites his readers and listeners to reflect on this situation, as well as on what it could mean to pursue philosophy in such a world. One could, of course, include Husserl on the list of the witnesses of a general sense of crisis, and in fact, much of Patočka's reflections on Europe can be understood as a critical appropriation of Husserl's crisis of the European sciences. Husserl, above all, comes to mind when Patočka observes that, for many thinkers such as Max Scheler, among others, Europe had always been assumed to be the center of gravity when reflecting on the crisis of modern humanity. Europe had inaugurated the modern age, and thus it would be European civilization alone that would prove capable of addressing the spiritual contradictions of modern existence. This was certainly the guiding assumption of Husserl in the crisis texts, as well as the articles on spiritual renewal written in the 1920s for the Japanese journal Kaitso. Patočka had a personal connection to this phase of Husserl's thinking, having studied with the master in Freiburg in the early 1930s. In 1935, as secretary of the Cercle Philosophique, Patočka helped to arrange Husserl's invitation to lecture in Prague. These lectures would form the basis of part one of the crisis. Husserl's more extensive lectures in Vienna, given several months earlier, under the title The Crisis of European Humanity and Philosophy, are also important and contain several theses that remained essential to Patočka's own thinking about Europe throughout his career. The central thesis of Husserl's Vienna lecture is that philosophy is essential to Europe. The thesis is not so much that philosophy is somehow exclusively European, or even that it represents a spiritual resource upon which a troubled Europe can draw. The point is far stronger. Philosophy as such is constitutive of the very idea of Europe, for the idea of a rational culture just is the guiding telos of European existence. Other cultures may cultivate philosophies, Husserl tells us, but it is only Europe that has made philosophy its guiding idea. Europe is thus not merely a geographical concept or a cultural formation with a particular history, though these may be involved as well, if only in a non-essential way. Europe is an idea. This means that the condition and fate of Europe is that of an idea, the idea of a rational, philosophical life, of a scientific vocation, both committed to truth and responsible for itself. This claim that Europe is primarily an idea has rarely been embraced by the more empirically minded. It is difficult to counter such skepticism, and I have no interest in defending Husserl on this front. At this point, I wish only to suggest that Husserl's reflections on Europe, and by extension Patočka's, are best understood in the context of the political struggles of the 1930s and 1970s, respectively. Again, the situation is important. For the cosmopolitan and scientifically oriented like Husserl, the retired aging university professor with a Bohemian Jewish background, these struggles were unambiguously existential. So too for Patočka. The stultifying repression of post-1968 Czechoslovakia was just the latest death rattle of a long terminal illness of a Europe that had formed the backdrop of his entire life. Yet at the same time, there is more to Husserl's position than these echoes of political and social upheaval. The core of Husserl's position is that the idea of reason is itself intrinsically historical. Rational life is not the result of history, but takes hold only as a history. The same can be said about the idea of universal humanity. It is not simply an idea that has a history. The humanity in question is possible only as a form of historical existence. The two, the idea of reason and the idea of universal humanity, go together. Historical humanity, conscious of a rationality as the horizon of its historical life, becomes in Husserl's thinking essentially equivalent to a universal rational humanity. This means that the idea of reason can only be illuminated through historical reflection, and in two interrelated senses. The first relies on the figure of the self-projection of the idea into the future, which for Husserl takes the form of an embrace of the task to live a rational life. Reason here is understood as a consciously posited practical imperative to live a certain way. As an imperative, the idea of reason cannot be a simple basis for identifying who one is as a member of a given cultural community, for it is never something given, only projected into the future. It is shared only in the sense that a free responsibility can be shared. At most, it is given as a challenge. If universality can also be said to emerge as a particular cultural reality called Europe, it is one only to the extent that such a reality can offer itself as a space within which the challenge of rational responsibility can be taken up and lived. If Husserl's thinking is Eurocentric, it is only because he believes that Europe remains contested ground for the universal, and with that, a peculiar magnet for anyone called to the task. Husserl thus describes the concrete historical emergence of the idea of reason as the appearance of individuals and communities dedicated to the task of conforming to the demands of reason. If decisive, the emergence of such individuals and communities represents the breakthrough of what Husserl describes, and I quote, as the epoch of mankind which now seeks to live and only can live in the free shaping of its existence, its historical life, through ideas of reason, through infinite tasks. Close quote. That the tasks of such a life are infinite implies the impossibility of their being completed in a finite sense. This means that Europe, taken in a finite historical sense, is not and can never be universal humanity in anything but a purely aspirational form. This is a consequence of its fundamental historical character. Universal humanity is an open horizon. It is visible at all only as a passage beyond the finite. What Husserl calls the inborn teleology of Europe, the orientation of the infinite task of universality, thus stands in contrast and dissonance with the concrete life of Europeans. Any philosophy, any Europe for that matter, is as a given empirical formation of the spirit only in anticipation of the ideal. This means that it is either a progression towards the realization of the idea, or it is a retreat from the idea and its negation. If so, then any specific form of historical existence should never be considered an unambiguously secure gain or loss. It is for this reason that Husserl in the Vienna lecture contrasts the spiritual teleology of the idea of Europe with the idea of a natural teleology of development that would proceed as a sequence of closed and repeatable forms. Such a natural teleology would entail a schema of historical transformation in which cultures might develop into forms that would be progressively more rational and universal, thus more European. Instead, Husserl argues, there is a chronically incomplete and open character of meaning that is implicitly true of any properly spiritual unity. which would preclude such a schema. And again, I quote Husserl. There is, for essential reasons, no zoology of peoples. They are spiritual unities. They do not have, and in particular the supranational unity of Europe does not have, a mature shape that has ever been reached or could be reached as a shape that is regularly repeated. Psychic humanity has never been complete and never will be, and can never repeat itself. The spiritual telos of European humanity, in which the particular telos of particular nations and of individual men is contained, lies in the infinite, is an infinite idea toward which, in concealment, the whole spiritual becoming aims, so to speak. Close quote. This aspect of Husserl's argument, not often sufficiently emphasized, is important to bear in mind. It suggests that it would be a mistake to identify the perspective of universal reason with any given cultural form, including Europe. It would also be a mistake to assume that universal reason is a static, superhistorical perspective that would provide a point of comparison for the relative development of what Husserl describes as spiritual unities. Universal reason is operative at all only in the concrete historical movement of spiritual life, in the projection of life towards an idea that is not yet fully understood, and chronically so. The ideal, the universal telos, can become a theme at all only in a reflection motivated by a sense of historical becoming, one that is in important ways always operative at the expense of one's own particularity. The second sense of historical reflection that would illuminate this spiritual history is oriented not to the future projected by the infinite task of the idea, but to its origin. This is again part of how Husserl understands the consciousness of historicity, specifically its role as condition for the tasks of reason. Historical consciousness is an awareness not only of the task represented by the future, but also of the sense of the emergence of this task represented by the past. That the two come together into a kind of circuit of sense justifies talk of a tradition. In both the in both the Vienna and Prague lectures, Husserl tells the familiar story of the emergence of the idea of philosophy as a specifically Greek event, thus tied to the time and place of a specific historical past. Yet philosophy, or the new attitude that emerges in ancient Greece, is even for Husserl not unproblematically Greek. This is not simply a question of the validity of giving a specific cultural historical site the honor of being the first. More important is the idea that philosophy as such, as a striving after infinite tasks, stands in necessary tension with any finite origin. As a tradition, philosophy must have an origin, thus a past. Yet the ideal horizon of the tradition is not circumscribed by the specific identity of this past. The very tradition of philosophy stands in an intrinsically critical relation to the very necessity of its past, rendering its identity unstable. In other words, philosophy only works, even as a tradition, when it actively contests its past, or any claim that philosophy has been established as a stable acquisition, or perhaps ever even really begun at all. Philosophy in Husserl's account is thus a very peculiar kind of tradition, one which carries with it a sense of an origin that is not genuinely bound to the site of its emergence. Unlike all other cultural works, Husserl writes, philosophy is not a movement of interest which is bound to the soil of the national tradition. Close quote. Husserl's claim that Greece is the beginning of philosophy should thus be taken more as a kind of parable of history than a fact of history. It is an idealized story of the birth of the universal as the transcendence of the context of the concrete life of a particular community. This implies that, however essential philosophy is to Europe as an idea, it is not bound to the soil of Europe. Otherwise, it would not be universal. This, of course, just intensifies the problem of the meaning of the origin, and by extension, just what is meant by talking of the tradition of philosophy, if that is to mean more than its contingent expression in specific literary practices or historical communities. For the way Husserl sets up his reflection, it is almost as if he intends to argue that the tradition of philosophy is in the end really a kind of anti-tradition, or even the negation of all possible traditions. One might even speculate that the beginning of something like philosophy, if it is to be understood as a breaking free of what necessarily precedes it, is always possible, and perhaps even common. Dissatisfaction with how things have been done, a desire for renewal, or just to escape the boredom of the familiar is perhaps all that is needed to posit the most basic conditions for philosophy. The difficulty in Husserl's conception is to understand how the origin of philosophy does not just lie in the desire to break free from the hold of non-philosophy, but how in turn this desire takes root and thus marks the emergence of a tradition. The origin is more than the first act of philosophical freedom. It is the beginning of a peculiar historical continuity that renews itself over time, generating that span between the moment of its emergence and the projection of the ideal as a task or an end. In Husserl, it is as if the desire for philosophy can take root only at the cost of introducing an inherent strangeness into the continuity thanks to which it takes shape as a tradition. Such strangeness, I would argue, is inherent to Husserl's conception of the universality of the idea of Europe. However essential the universal may be to the idea of Europe, it is also disruptive in that it inwardly problematizes the very particularity of Europe. However true it may be that Europe never ceases to be conditioned by its traditional forms, its national and folk identities, it is also true that philosophy is a part of Europe only if it takes the form of a kind of stranger within, as if Europe were chronically in conflict with its own idea. The conflict in question for Husserl is not merely one of identity. It has to do with the very way one is in tune with the surrounding world, or how one comports oneself in relation to the demands of life. Husserl tries to capture this by describing a contrast of attitudes. One is pre-scientific and natural in the sense of an orientation to the horizon of the given and the accepted, or that which functions as the traditional bedrock of collective life. The other attitude is theoretical, critical in posture, striving to take nothing for granted, to openly question everything. These attitudes stand in contradiction, but at the same time, they also interpenetrate one another. Husserl describes, in effect, a kind of historical dialectic. The periodic disruptions of theoretical critique alternate with a kind of recalibration of the whole of natural existence. This specifies in turn what Husserl means by the infinite task of rational life. The concrete pursuit of the task of reason unfolds as an inner transformation of concrete natural existence. The interests of natural existence always remain operative, but are progressively reshaped in a kind of permanent revolution from within. Again, I quote Husserl. Scientific culture under the guidance of ideas of infinity means, then, a revolution of the whole culture, a revolution of the whole manner in which mankind makes culture. It also means a revolution of its historicity, which is now the history of the curtailment of finite mankind's development as it becomes mankind with infinite tasks. Close quote. For Husserl, Europe is nothing less than the name for the historical vanguard of this curtailment of the preponderance of finite, closed forms of humanity. It is, Husserl writes, the universal critique of all life and all life goals, all cultural products and systems that have already arisen out of the life of man, and thus it also becomes a critique of mankind itself and of the values which guide it explicitly or implicitly. Close quote. Europe for Husserl thus names neither a place nor a group of cultures, but the finite vehicle of an infinite praxis, and here I quote again, whose aim is to elevate mankind through universal scientific reason, according to norms of truth of all forms, to transform it from the bottom up into a new humanity, made capable of an absolute self-responsibility on the basis of absolute theoretical insights. Close quote. You can all hear me okay? I've been told I speak softly, so if I start speaking too softly, let me know. Though Europe for Husserl, in an important sense, represents the curtailment of its own finite identity in favor of the ideal of a universal rational humanity, he nevertheless assumes, somewhat contrary to the logic of his thinking, that Europe can still be the clear title for the vanguard of reason. The European sciences remain the only possible point of concrete reference for the idea of a philosophical life. In this way, Husserl effectively conflates his commitment to the renewal of the vocation of philosophy with a defense of his identity as a European, as if the question of the possibility of a universal humanity just is the question of being European. This is an assumption that Patočka questions some 40 years after Husserl's lectures in Vienna and Prague. In Plato in Europe, Patočka asks his listeners whether it makes any sense to posit Europe as the inevitable point of departure for the self-determination of universal humanity. Has not the center instead shifted, he asks, such that in fact the question can no longer be about Europe, but must instead be about humanity in a planetary sense, or about the human condition as it is manifest in what has become a global situation? Patočka's answer is unequivocal. It can only be planetary, whatever that means or could mean, for Europe has come to an end. And here I quote Patočka. It is clear today when Europe has come to an end. Europe, that 2,000-year-old construction which managed to lift mankind to an altogether new degree of self-reflection and consciousness and strength and power as well, when this historical reality, which for a long time supposed that it encompassed all of mankind, that it is mankind and that all else is worthy of neglect, is definitively at an end. Close quote. If Europe is nevertheless still a question, it is now one of how, in the situation of a planetary humanity, the legacy of Europe can play a meaningful role in the situation of a post-European world. There are several aspects of Patočka's approach to the question of the legacy of Europe for what comes after Europe that merit emphasis. The first relates to Patočka's appropriation of Husserl's question about how philosophy emerges and establishes itself in the world as a way of life, or even a form of civilization. In Patočka's version of this reflection on origins, the history he is interested in reconstructing is animated by a spirit that he associates with the ancient motif of the care for the soul. Patočka's philosophical and historical exploration of this motif is predicated on a fundamental rearticulation of the Husserlian conception of a rational culture. The care for the soul can be understood as the fusion of three spiritual attitudes. The first is the drive to question that forms the impetus of philosophy. The second is an embrace of the risk of freedom that forms the core of political life. And the third is the consciousness of an open, indeterminate future that characterizes a self-consciously historical existence. All these attitudes are for Patočka co-original, and they come together in the figure of rational self-responsibility. Historically, they predate Europe proper, intertwine throughout its history in a series of complex configurations, and remain contested ground in the wake of its collapse. Another salient feature of Patočka's reflections is that this trifecta of philosophy, politics, and history is not assumed to be a stable, fixed constellation. Again, this represents an important innovation of Husserl's conception of the history of the philosophical idea, which always assumed a guiding telos that only required clarification to be effective. Patočka's emphasis is instead on the experience of contingencies that give unexpected urgency to our questions, throwing us back on the question or problem that we are for ourselves, demanding a new interpretation. The most important of these experiences are historically correlated with a sequence of failures: the collapse of the polis, the dissolution of Roman civilization, the rupture of the medieval world, the catastrophic wars of the 20th century. Patočka reads the history of the care for the soul as a series of responses to such catastrophes. Each catastrophe is unique, but each in its own way sets into motion the promise of philosophy, thus forming the basis for a kind of family resemblance or spiritual resonance. The result of this approach is that the historical narrative for Patočka is considerably more complex than it was for Husserl. The details are also more important for Patočka than they had been for Husserl, and for philosophical reasons. There are no parables here, no faith in an inborn teleology guiding the whole. The particulars matter, and are never inessential, for it is precisely as particulars that they express an existential truth. The legacies at work here, in other words, are not complete and fixed paradigms and archetypes, preserved by tradition in ways that make them both transparent and practically efficacious. There is instead a manifold of contingent legacies that from the very beginning are transmitted through distortions, forgetting, failures, and forms of life that prove to be ultimately dead ends, but through which we can catch a glimpse of the fundamental existential problematicity of human existence, which for Patočka is arguably the genuine universal and the ultimate ground for meaning. In the end, Patočka's is a project not so much to preserve a given idea of Europe as an attempt to rediscover the potential force of philosophy as a cultivation of human problematicity. The question of post-Europe is, accordingly, whether the most recent death of Europe in the 20th century brings the history of the care for the soul to an end, or whether something like a global emergence of a universal civilization is possible, one that would no longer be European, but distinctively human. The spiritual prospects for this post-European future, Patočka argues, will ultimately depend on the possibility of a universal philosophy, by which he understands our collective capacity to embrace the tasks of meaning. Now, I'd like to close with some critical observations. These observations are motivated by a certain reticence on my behalf when it comes to the ways that Husserl and Patočka foreground the figure of Europe. My own view is that Europe is at best a relatively coherent unit of analysis when it is used to designate the diverse nexus of histories that have unfolded on the western tip of the Eurasian continent in the wake of the gradual dissolution of the Roman Empire. I am more comfortable, in other words, when things are limited to empirical history, and less so when talk turns to sweeping claims regarding the essence of European culture as a rational civilization, or its identification with an idea of a rational, universal humanity. This is especially true when it comes to philosophy. One of the things that I find so attractive about philosophy is its promise to slip past any constraints of tradition, even if it does not always succeed. Like art and literature, philosophy is one of those opportunities to be someone other than oneself, to think and create in unexpected ways. To insist that all this is somehow connects to being European or Western or Chinese or Indian or whatever just seems to me to miss the point. Supplementing this reticence is a sense that the entire discussion we find in Patočka, not to mention Husserl, is rather dated. This is the case even if we follow Patočka's transformation of Husserl's question of Europe into the question of post-Europe. Patočka's description of the post-European situation is clearly an artifact of the Cold War and reflects that moment when the dominance of Europe had been replaced by a world divided between the two global powers of the United States and the Soviet Union. One global order had essentially been replaced by another. This is one of the registers in which we should read Patočka's concept of post-Europe. Patočka expresses the hope that with this transformation of the world order, something like a global civilization could emerge, if only certain obstacles or ideological contradictions could be overcome. Today, almost a half century later, we live in a world that is far more fragmented. Even our ideas about how the world is organized, such as the contrast between the global north and the global south, are predicated on the assumption of a situation that is more fluid and dynamic. There are, of course, salient aspects of the contemporary world that do invite comparison with the situation in which Patočka was writing, such as the dominance of technoscience and global capitalism, but what the basic parameters might be for a common human understanding have become far more elusive. At most, we might have a heightened sense of a shared situation, but even that has limits, as the growing tragedy of the climate disaster is showing us. Yet there is another dimension to Patočka's legacy I would like to emphasize, and it bears directly in why he remains such an important figure in the memory of Central Europe, if not also beyond. If Patočka was the philosopher who bore witness to the end of a Europe that had once been motivated by the ideal of the care for the soul, he was also someone who continued to embody its promise in increasingly difficult times. Patočka, the quiet philosophy professor who late in life joined with Havel and others to become one of the leading dissidents of Charter 77, acted as a conduit for the transmission of what Thomas Masaryk would have called the ideals of humanity, at a time and a place that had become increasingly hostile to the life of the mind. However dated Patočka's assessment of the situation may be, his legacy of resistance still resonates with us today. This is not a digression. How Patočka comported himself in his situation is as important as his attempts to understand its meaning, and both the comportment and the understanding belong to his life as a philosopher. And as a philosopher, Patočka not only kept the faith that philosophy mattered, but he also showed that it was all possible. This is not merely a question of preserving intellectual traditions in times of confusion, or holding together a community of the faithful and allowing for a generational transmission of the spiritual insights of the past. There are many who did this, and still do, in a world that has never been anything but ambivalent when it comes to ideas. Instead, Patočka showed that in an environment inhospitable to the very practice of philosophy, whether due to official censure or to a culture hostile to intellectual life, it is still possible to dedicate oneself to the rigors of questioning. Philosophical life is not simply a matter of a commerce with traditions, whether preserving or contributing, ignoring or criticizing them. It also has to do with living the very questions that such traditions reflect, questions that remain in force even when the traditional means for their articulation stumble. What it means to be born, to be dependent on others, and others dependent on you, what it is possible to see, to understand, the mystery of death and the surprise of love. The common cultural heritage of human beings, that non-system of human expression of which Europe is in the end only a ripple in the stream, invariably provides powerful means for posing and addressing such questions. But the catalyst is always the concrete life one lives with others. If so, then perhaps the whole construction of Europe in Patočka's thought is misleading. Perhaps Europe is only his name for the situation from which he for which he addresses his listeners and now readers as he seeks to grapple with the problem of making sense of a confusing world. And perhaps even the very construct of civilization is misleading, since it tends to draw our attention away from the irreducible plurality of humanity with the siren call of a false unity. There is no civilization as such, Patočka himself writes in the Heretical Essays. The question is whether historical humans are still willing to embrace history. Perhaps this should be the opening premise of any reflection on Patočka's reflections on what comes after Europe and the role philosophy might still play. There is no civilization proper, only the urgent need to embrace our common future as a collective task. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, James, for this beautiful and think-provoking uh, talk. And now, please feel free to raise questions.
Just to break the ice, I have two sort of relatively small questions, and one goes to the very heart of your talk. By the way, thanks. I think it was beautiful. So, first question is a curiosity. At some point, you raised doubts about Husserl's claim that philosophy first arises in Greece. There may be many reasons why one should dispute that, but I'm curious as to yours. The second is you seem very assertive at some point when you say that philosophy is about questioning and revolting against one's past. And I wonder if that is not itself a rather historically determinate thesis, uh, which seems to me specifically modern, if not dialectical or Hegelian. For example, if you think of philosophy arising from a sense of wonder in Plato and Aristotle, it doesn't seem to me that we should go with that version. The more substantial question, I mean, sympathy with your reservations about sweeping claims and empirical history. If Europe is an idea, then, well, first question I have is then it's striking that you studied with, a preface about actual European history, such as the Treaty of Westphalia, or and so on and so forth. Was that form of rhetoric to usher us into your topic? And the real question is this: if this is a parable or an idealized story, obviously in Husserl is adamant, Europe is not to be understood in a geographical or historical sense. And you have that famous passage about the Eskimos or Native Americans and so on and so forth. Then what kind of story is it? What's the status and the value of a story like this? If there may be a recurse to the ideal when you're trying to make sense of phenomena, but phenomena will have to overlap with the ideal. And in this case, it seems to me that, as per your admission, Husserl thinks, well, this is at the expense of the empirical, at the expense of the concrete historical moment that Europeans are living, that he is giving us this version of Europe as an idea. So a different version of this question is, if names are misleading, would it be the same for you if we could say, if we were talking about something like the culture of the West as opposed to Europe and its history? And it seems to me that in the end, if I understand you correctly, your take is one that I fully sympathize with, and that is, whatever we make of these claims, what we value is Patočka's resistance to that when you said that his legacy still rings true in light of that.
Thank you. There's a lot there, so I'll try to be efficient in going through your questions. I mean, the first about the doubts that Greece represents the beginning of philosophy. In part, I'm evoking Patočka's own understanding of how to approach this thesis of Husserl's, because what's striking about his historical reflections is that he's very interested in, let's say, the proto history of philosophy, of sources, let's say, cultural and spiritual sources that predate Greece, that are situated in ancient Sumeria and in Babylonia. He does a lot with the Epic of Gilgamesh, and this idea that there's something like a fundamental mythological framework, as he puts it, which has its genesis as a result of a much wider, as it were, span of Mediterranean history that feeds into Greece, into this particular moment of Greece. So it isn't as if Greece is sort of philosophy that just comes out of nowhere and destroys prejudice, if you will. There's something, as it were, there's a deeper anti-philosophical as well, but also a framework of, let's say, mythical self-understanding that philosophy presupposes. So Patočka is someone who, like someone like a Brodel or someone who wants to take a kind of longue durée perspective when we try to interpret and understand what this Greek moment really represents and what it is. The second, the question about the revolt against the past, you're absolutely right. That's something that it is a very modern idea. It's something I think that Patočka shares with Husserl, even if they come at the justification in different ways. It's something that was so fundamental to my education, my own education as a philosopher, that I find it difficult to question. But I think it needs to be questioned. Um, um, this kind of I mean, one of my current interests is a set of courses I'm trying to develop in ancient Chinese thought, in which there's something of that kind of notion present, but it's not unproblematic. It's not a clear gesture. And in a way, that's what makes Chinese philosophy for me so interesting. So I think that's something, I think it comes out in the paper because I'm really trying to sort of reconstruct and to get into the flow of the thinking of both Husserl and Patočka on these matters. And you're right, that's something that's just presupposed, right? When we get any expression, historical expression of a rejection of the past, then the instinct is that that's a moment that's purely philosophical. But I definitely think that you're raising an important question, that this needs to be put in some perspective. Now, as for the more sort of um, the question of the empirical history, I begin with just a kind of evocation of the history of Europe as the history of many Europes, and also evoking this sense that is always emphasized by Patočka's own reconstruction of these histories, that essentially he's only interested in history when there's something like a crisis or a catastrophe that can be described. Because in a sense, that's when something like the possibility of philosophy comes into play, right? It becomes something that is a living possibility and not just the transmission of a figure, an idea, or a practice, right? The way that differs with Husserl is Husserl also is in texts like The Origin of Geometry, in part two of The Crisis, with that extended discussion of Galileo and the origin of modern science. He's also making the point that something like a historical reflection of change and transformation is necessary to, as it were, as a point of departure for understanding what, let's say, science or philosophy is for us. But for Husserl, it's always a question of the using history as a means to clarify something that he believes belongs to the spiritual essence of the scientific tradition or the philosophical tradition. So for Husserl, the beginning of another example is the discussion of Plato in the introduction of formal and transcendental logic, is the question of being in possession of an idea or an ideal that organizes the very activity of scientific understanding, but which we have failed to come to a clear understanding of, and therefore we get thrown into problems, right? We get thrown into ambiguities. We're not quite sure what the success of science actually means because we're not quite clear on just what the guiding ideal is. So it's this idea that we can be guided by an idea without being fully clear as to exactly what it is, and only be able to ask a certain set of questions about its meaning, only given a certain development. And therefore, something like an empirical history is necessary in order to try to recalibrate our understanding of the meaning that's only slowly becoming articulated as it develops, something along these lines. For Patočka, again, going back to his interest in catastrophes, it's more trying to discover a resonance with our own catastrophe in order to be able to rediscover, in an existential sense, the possibility of philosophical thinking. So it's no longer a question of clarification. Or if it is a question of clarification, it's on a very different register, let's say, than the kind of theoretical clarification of meaning as what you have in Husserl. So it's more, instead of the clarification of meaning, it's the rediscovery of the possibility of philosophy as an existential situation. So not just rhetoric, there's something there.
There are also several people online, including several Husserl students. So if you have questions, just raise your hand and we'll put you through the microphone.
Thank you, James. It's a wonderful talk. Just to follow up on the idea of crisis and the rupture with the tradition. I was wondering whether, well, I basically do not completely agree that we don't have, for example, in Plato, the idea of a political thinking that gets rid of the tradition at the very beginning. I mean, that basically recognizes that philosophy begins once you question a tradition. For example, the Republic begins by basically getting rid of Cephalus at the beginning. And Cephalus is someone who is obsequious to the rites and gives answers that are more or less religiously and conventionally acceptable, etc. I think probably, I wonder if you agree or if this would be acceptable from the perspective of either Husserl or Patočka, that the idea that, for example, you find in the Republic, it's a complicated thought, but it's the idea that politics very often, or a tradition, tends to present itself as natural just because it repeats itself. And so this horizon that you described, where you can, the future is recurrent and things recur as if you could predict them and so on, which superimposes the human life to the natural life, is what an ideology of tradition is made of. And I think that by beginning the Republic by saying, okay, Cephalus is going to go, then we even invent a lie in the middle of the Republic about the origin, and we clearly say it is a lie. I think those are all ways to suggest that there is a deep difference between a tradition, basically to suggest that the Greeks, at least Plato, were well aware of the difference between a tradition, the way philosophy breaks with a tradition, the way culture is different from nature, and all of that. And the other source, I wonder whether it's of any interest at all, is Thucydides, where basically the idea of crisis is fundamental in order to understand history. I wonder if one couldn't think of Thucydides as the other side of philosophical, instead of saying, okay, we have a historian and a philosopher, we have two ways that dialectically interact of understanding philosophy of history by considering the crisis and hence the empirical way of looking at things, and also of showing how ideals don't really match reality and vice versa. So, but this is only a thought about the tradition, and I don't know whether this fits with you.
Well, I think it fits very much with how Patočka understands the situation, perhaps even more so than Husserl. because I mean, you have these extensive readings of ancient Greek thinkers, Plato, as Aristotle, pre-Socratic philosophy. He's very interested in Anaximander and Heraclitus, and his understanding of Socrates in particular as a kind of transitional figure between a kind of proto-mythical world and Platonic metaphysics, and that even Plato himself uses Socrates in the development of let's say a metaphysical perspective with regard to sort of approaches to thinking and reflection and questions. That so he can, as it were, be more than Plato, right, in a sense, by appealing to the continued presence of something that Patočka understands as irremovable in human existence. And that again is this mythical kind of framework. And so the way in which, for example, he understands Socrates in the Republic specifically is that it's not a question of sort of breaking free from the tradition completely, right? It's only the recognition that embodied in people like Cephalus is that the tradition is no longer defensible because it can no longer be taken for granted because it becomes so absurd, right? And then you have the problem of tyranny, right? To simply embrace power without any traditional constraints for its own sake. And for Patočka, Socrates represents, as it were, a kind of defense of the tradition, a recognition that there's something about the tradition that can't be completely, as we can't cut ourselves off from completely. But that what's necessary is to demand more of a justification than what tradition had been traditionally able to, as it were, mount for itself. So in other words, to argue for the kind of world of a moral order that Cephalus represents, but using different means than were available to Cephalus. But this is very much how Patočka understands the emergence of the notion of the care for the soul, is now a more demanding, as it were, self-justification, precisely for those commitments that remain necessary in order to be a human being, namely that act will tie me once again to the tradition, is now a question of my own self-perfection, my own self-responsibility, if you will. So I think there's and then of course, so crisis, the moments of disruption, the kind of radicalism of philosophy is never a clean rupture. Is always this kind of dialectic between the continued presence of, certainly in terms, the kind of sort of natural presupposed life world of which we're all ingrained and integrated, and then the manner in which it becomes problematic, but also resolved in various ways, given this sort of periodic disruptions of philosophical activity and thought. So there's never a philosophical life is never something that's completely, as it were, frees itself from a natural life. It's always a life in a world. It's always a life in the concreteness of the situation, which is again why I keep sort of throughout the paper trying to bring us back to thinking about, well, what does it mean not only to articulate an ideal of philosophy, but to understand it as something that is necessarily pursuable only in some kind of self-awareness of being in a particular situation, the parameters of which are not conceptually or theoretically defined. They're more than that. They're always more than that. And the point about Thucydides, I think that's just right. I think Patočka is perhaps more than Husserl in a much stronger position to be able to appropriate a Herodotus or a Thucydides or these kinds of, if you will, non-philosophical, but still sharing an enormous amount with philosophy with regard to just trying to understand what a human being is, right? What a human community is, or what events mean, right? This kind of thing. So thank you for the question.
Sophia.
Thank you for your interesting talk. And I was just wondering, since you talk about the importance for Patočka's thought about situation and context, At which extent do you think that the particular situation of in-betweenness and marginalization of Central Eastern Europe has influenced Patočka's reflections about Europe and his formulation about post-Europe? Thank you.
I think it's absolutely central. There's a letter I saw when I was just in Vienna. They have the Patočka archive at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, and there's a letter that Patočka wrote to Landgrebe, Ludwig Landgrebe in Freiburg, basically asking him to send him books. Right, this is sort of the plight of many intellectuals trying to get their hands on books in Behind the Iron Curtain. And he says that I feel something like a Robinson on my island, right? Like a Robinson Crusoe on my island, to sort of cut off, still, as it were, a part of what's happening in the philosophical community, what's happening in Europe, but not a part of Europe, somehow divided from it. And this was something that was broadly shared, a feeling that was broadly shared and played a very influential role on many intellectuals. And so Havel's program after '89 was basically go back to Europe, right? To turn, as it were, back to become a member of a certain kind of political historical community. And notions that he calls his book the heretical essays. He tries to emphasize, especially in the final chapters, the final essays of that volume. He very much is keen to think of the peculiar plight of the philosopher in a world that is, and I tried to express it in the paper, it's almost as if it's designed to be a place as inhospitable as possible for a philosopher. Right? And of course, the immediate sort of description of his own life, his own situation. He was someone who was only allowed to teach at the university for a very limited amount of time throughout his entire career. During the Second World War, the Germans closed down all the Czech universities. He was able to begin teaching. He taught a number of courses in the history of philosophy just after the war, but he refused to join the Communist Party. And so when the communist coup took over, he was once again excluded from teaching at the university. He was part of this underground seminar flying university phenomenon, in which he would teach Plato and Husserl and Kant in his apartment and in other private venues, as it were, undercover. And then even when he was finally allowed to teach again during the Prague Spring, this didn't even last a full academic year, or not much more than that. And he was forced into retirement in the early 70s. And it's at that point that he wrote maybe his most interesting works, the heretical essays, the two studies of Masaryk. He began, in a sense, reinvented himself in his 70s, excluded from the university, into, as it were, the Patočka who would become famous. And it's also important to realize that he never embraced dissident or political engagement at all before that period, before that final period of his life. He was an apolitical person, which is why he was so important for Charter 77, because that's exactly what they wanted. They wanted someone who was apolitical for reasons we can get into. So I think it's absolutely essential. And in a way, I've been struggling to really try to reconstruct that experience because it's so alien to my own when it comes to philosophy. It's very much a kind of lost world that I don't pretend to have any deep insight into, but I am convinced that it's a very, very important aspect of Patočka's philosophical life. Yeah. I just think I'm talking too much.
Just a very quick question or consideration. Just following up your claims about Patočka not being involved directly in politics until the end. Well, yes, he wasn't engaged into political action or active political dissidence, but um, I don't know, but as I read and used Patočka as a kind, he was called the Socrates of Prague, but as a kind of philosopher who conceived of philosophy as a form of politics, in a way, as a way of life that at the same time could have some political consequences. And I think that it's for this that Foucault mentioned Patočka and suggested his students to read Patočka apropos of the course about philosophy as a way of life, or as a way of ethos, as a way of counterconduct. Mm. So also his emphasis on Europe is not as much an idealization of past philosophy, as you very well said, but it was a polemical concept in the situation of Eastern Europe and the isolated situation of Eastern Europe. To emphasize the role of Europe was a polemical concept, not an idealization of Europe, I think. So it was a very indirect way to think of philosophy as a way of resistance to domination, I think. So, and even though he was engaged directly into politics just at the end, I think that his way of doing philosophy was this kind of resistance. I don't know if you think that's my interpretation, it's a stretch.
No. I think you're very right, and I would agree with that. So I was only saying no political involvement in a very narrow sense, very
Yes.
narrowly defined sense.
Course,
But you're right in the sense, and this is actually important for Patočka philosophically, because as I outline the three spiritual postures that make up the care for the soul, right? So the political philosophy and historical consciousness, they're not separate things for Husserl. For Patočka, they come together,
yes.
right? And not only that, but they have to be understood in terms of this figure from Heraclitus that Patočka is always citing, namely they're polemos, they're polemical in character, right? Yes. Fundamentally so. So they always involve some kind of contestation of meaning, which is also at the same time a contestation of power, right? So that they can't be sort of untied from each other. They come together. So even under, as it were, refusing in a kind of superficial sense political activity, doesn't mean that philosophical life, as you're pointing to, it doesn't represent a kind of engagement in the space of a common life that is organized around this figure of polemos. And polemos, that only means, as it were, sort of the capacity we have to exercise violence in order to try to shape a situation, or the capacity we have to be open to the manipulations of power. But polemos is also tied in Heraclitus, and Patočka is very interested in this, to the theme of understanding, to the theme of phronesis, as it were, right? So polemos is, as it were, it sort of is connected to a capacity we have to read a particular situation for what it is. And that's as much a philosophical act as it is a political act, if you will. And also something which, given, again, the open character of all human situations, is intrinsically historical. So yeah, we agree. No polemos there.
C'è qualcuno?
There's a
Sara?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, thanks a lot for your beautiful lecture. My question is related to your beautiful idea that we maybe should abandon this idea of Europe, even if not in concrete terms, as a kind of embodiment of the idea of philosophy itself. And also with this idea that the philosophical endeavor itself is kind of a continuous effort to break with the tradition. And yet, with the problem that even in this effort of breaking with the tradition, we still remain, in a certain sense, into a kind of particular cultural reality. And so my question would be, does the idea of a unity of history still stand, and how does it configures it at the level of a more collective effort as humanity? And also, does still the idea of a unity of philosophy stands, and how is it?
So, so thank you. Thank you for the question. So just a couple remarks. I mean, I think what I was trying to express that I very much think one can find in Patočka, more so than someone in Husserl, is this idea that what this possibility of philosophy for us would be an opportunity, maybe even a gift, to be able to begin again. I mean, in a way, to break with tradition, to kind of disrupt it, is to claim that it's meaningful to begin again, even if not purely out of nowhere, right? Always have to, as we're begin using and relying on resources of the past, relying on assumptions that we all have to make just to get started. But the idea that there's something possible about philosophy as a new beginning. This is something that I think Patočka, again, more so than Husserl, embraces, because for Patočka, there's no promise of a kind of finality, an end result. I mean, Husserl also thought that beginning again was part of the teleological history of European humanity. But he also thought that transcendental phenomenology would be what he called the Endstiftung of the very sense of rationality. That in a way, at some point, we'll come to a historical self-understanding where we can basically exit history. And I don't think that's something that Patočka accepts. I don't think it's something that it's too Hegelian in a sense, right? That there's some kind of completion that can somehow be achieved. And that's something that I share. And again, right, also recognizing that continuity with the past is effectively inevitable. I mean, the past keeps reclaiming its rights to fix and define how we think and how we act and how we comport ourselves. And in a sense, within that relationship with that kind of resistance of the past, let's say, in tension with it, is again, I think the philosophical moment for Patočka is the rediscovery of the possibility of thinking, of beginning again, if you will, right? Despite everything. So in a sense, it's a so again, the figure of resistance comes into play as being important for the way in which he conceives himself. And that's something I think I would like to say I share that. And I think it's it's definitely an idea that's given me much pause. If I hope I understood what your question. Would you like to follow up and ask your question again?
No, yes. No, I think
Okay.
you understood it.
I
Yes.
answered it. Oh, okay. Thank you.
Qualche altra domanda?
Thank you very much for your talk. Just to follow up about new beginnings, because this idea of kind of dwelling with the past, with in a way that we are not burdened with tradition, with like a break kind of tradition, made me think about Hannah Arendt work about the break with tradition and also a new relationship with the past. And I wanted to ask you if there is also in Patočka the possibility of thinking this practice of resistance also with viewing the past as a kind of the Walter Benjamin metaphor of the diving, the oh my God. Il sub, no, il pescatore di perle, the diving man, the pearl diver, sorry, the pearl diver, kind of seeing in the past, not a kind of fixed tradition, but a kind of plurality of possibilities.
Yes, I mean, then again, there's the other side of me, which loves that kind of activity, that loves the pearl diving, if you will. I mean, there's another side of me which would I mean, part of what I actually was trying to do here with these two thinkers, Husserl and Patočka, and which is inspired by an idea from Gadamer. There's this notion that if you really want to understand a philosopher or a philosophy, then the exercise ought to be one of trying to inhabit those patterns of thought, right? Trying to, as it were, imagine what it would be to live in a world in which that philosophy made sense and actually articulated the truth of things. So to, in a kind of Aristotelian idea, entertain an idea without necessarily believing it, but rigorously and seriously entertaining it. And I think, again, the Gadamerian principle is this requires a certain act of philosophical imagination. And any kind of historical inquiry involves that. So there's something, I know I'm contradicting myself, but I'm a philosopher, so I can do that. It's part of the profession. Is that on the one hand, there is this idea that to be a philosopher is someone who, as it were, can inhabit the site of a certain kind of break, a certain kind of rupture, in order for something new to occur. If that's missing, then something essential to philosophical, as it were, life and passion is missing. But on the other hand, a great deal of what philosophy is as a practice is an engagement, however critical it may be, however historical, with the past, with ideas, with others, with other attempts to be a philosopher or to do philosophy, and to inhabit those spaces and move in those worlds in such a way that they become legible, but also keeping in mind that there's always something peculiarly strange about them as well, right? I mean, if you don't always feel a certain strangeness about ancient philosophy when you're trying to understand it, then in a way you're missing an opportunity to capture both the possibility of a connection, but also an identification of what makes it individual, what makes it something specific, and therefore interesting. So I think there's I mean, and again, Patočka for me is a thinker who can, as walk and chew gum at the same time, as we say in English, right? So he can sort of make this this very modern idea of a rupture or break with the past, this theme of freedom. He can keep that central to what he does philosophically, but at the same time cultivate this amazing imaginary world in which he encounters, in a very rigorous and a very honest, open way, the thought of a Kant, the thought of a Hegel. He actually translated Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit into Czech, as well as the logic. And so this is someone who clearly, had this remarkable philosophical imagination, right? So freedom and imagination, in a way, fundamentally coordinate with each other in the kind of philosopher that Patočka was.
Altre domande?
Was Erazim Kohak a student of Patočka's?
No, but Krzysztof Mikowski was.
Ok.
He was my dissertation advisor, was a student, but
Really? Ok, se non ci sono ci sono domande, non voglio interrompere nessuno. Direi che potete ancora sfruttare il professor Dodd venerdì mattina, e se non ci sono altre domande lo ringraziamo di cuore. Grazie.
Thank you.